Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The symbol on the door.
It was a chilly October morning when I first noticed something strange. I had just moved to Oakwood a few weeks ago with my husband, Tom, and was still getting used to the quiet rhythm of this small town. The morning fog hung low, casting a ghostly veil over the neighborhood as I sipped my coffee on the front porch. I saw Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman from 2 houses down, hurrying past my lawn with a look of concern etched on her face. She glanced at her door, which seemed to have an unusual mark on it. My curiosity was piqued, so I decided to take a closer look after she left. I walked over to her house and saw it clearly for the first time. A peculiar symbol had been painted on her door. It was a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, almost like a distorted sun or a spider's web. The paint was fresh, and the lines were uneven, as though someone had applied it hastily. My initial reaction was confusion. It seemed like the kind of thing a child might do as a prank, but there was something about it that felt different. Darker, maybe. I took a quick photo with my phone, figuring it might be worth mentioning to Tom later. As I returned to my own house, I noticed that the same mark appeared on several other doors along our street. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was unsettling to think that this symbol was popping up on so many homes, but I tried to push it out of my mind as a mere coincidence. That afternoon, Tom and I decided to walk around the neighborhood to see if anyone else had noticed the symbols. Most of our neighbors were just as perplexed as we were, and there were hushed conversations about what it could mean. Some suggested it was part of a new marketing campaign or a local artist's installation. But the more we talked to people, the more it became clear that no one had a definitive answer. Despite the attempts to brush it off, the mark on Mrs. Jenkins' door lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister about it, especially when combined with the odd sense of foreboding that seemed to hang in the air. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a series of events that would turn our quiet town into a nightmare. It had been a few days since the strange symbols appeared, and the mood in Oakwood had shifted. People were on edge, glancing nervously at their doors and locking them more securely. Tom and I had also started to feel the unease, but we were determined not to let it control our lives. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed the local news on TV. The anchor's voice was serious, and the headline made my heart skip a beat: "Mysterious Disappearance in Oakwood." The report was about the Petersons, a family from the street behind us, who had vanished without a trace. Their house had been discovered completely locked up. No signs of forced entry, no disturbances inside, just an empty house and a missing family. But the most chilling detail was that their front door had the same symbol painted on it. It was as if the mark had somehow predicted their disappearance. Tom and I exchanged worried glances. We knew the Petersons from a few neighborhood gatherings, and they seemed like a normal, happy family. The idea that something so sinister could be happening right in our community was terrifying. The police were investigating, but as days passed, there were no new leads. The entire town was on high alert. People were talking about increased security measures, and there were discussions about whether the symbol had anything to do with the disappearance. I remember sitting in our living room, trying to comfort myself with the idea that this was just a coincidence. But deep down, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The symbol had gone from being an odd curiosity to a possible link to something truly horrifying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the news report in my mind and wondering about the Petersons. What could have happened to them? How could a family simply vanish without a trace? Tom and I decided to check our own home security measures once again, making sure all the locks were secure and the windows were tightly shut. As I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with fears about what might come next. The next morning, the police were still canvassing the neighborhood, talking to residents and trying to piece together any clues they could find. I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched, that something sinister was lurking just out of sight. The symbol had become more than just an odd mark. It was a chilling omen of something far worse to come. And as I watched the police cars drive past our house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were next. The sense of unease in Oakwood only intensified with each passing day. The town was abuzz with rumors, theories, and a palpable sense of fear. I was trying to go about my daily routine, but the recent events had cast a long shadow over everything. One late afternoon, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. The weather was unusually gloomy, with dark clouds hanging heavy in the sky. As I walked down the street, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A new symbol had appeared on a door just a few houses down from us. My heart raced as I approached the door. The symbol was unmistakable, identical to the one on the Petersons' door. The same jagged lines and distorted circle. It was as if the mark was taunting us, daring us to ignore it. I quickly took a few photos with my phone and hurried back home, my steps quick and nervous. Tom was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, and I showed him the pictures. His face turned ashen as he looked at the image. "Not again," he muttered, his voice filled with dread. We decided to report it to the police, but by the time they arrived, the symbol had already been removed. I felt a mix of frustration and fear as we explained what we had seen. The officers reassured us they were doing everything they could, but I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were just as baffled as we were. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of impending doom. The house was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of a dog barking. The symbol had become more than just a strange occurrence. It felt like a harbinger of something far worse. I kept thinking about the new mark and how it seemed to be spreading. What could it possibly mean? And why were these symbols appearing on our doors? The questions swirled in my mind, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread. The next morning, I noticed that people were even more on edge than before. Neighbors were talking about the new symbol, and there was a growing sense of paranoia. The once friendly town was now a place where everyone seemed to be watching each other, looking for any signs of danger. As I went about my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to be amplified. It was as if the symbol had cast a dark cloud over us, and there was no escaping it. The fear was palpable, and the town's atmosphere had shifted from uneasy to outright terrifying. I tried to stay strong, but the growing sense of dread was overwhelming. I knew that whatever was happening in Oakwood was far from over, and I couldn't help but feel that things were about to get much worse. The days felt like they were dragging on, each one blending into the next with an oppressive sense of dread hanging over the town. Despite the police's assurances, no new leads had surfaced, and the atmosphere in Oakwood was thick with fear. One evening, after Tom and I had finished dinner, I decided to take another walk. The sense of cabin fever was getting to me, and I hoped a bit of fresh air would help clear my mind. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The usual hum of crickets and distant chatter was absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I wandered aimlessly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind was consumed by the recent events, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the park that I noticed a figure standing in the distance, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. My heart skipped a beat. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but I felt an icy chill run down my spine. I stood frozen, staring at the shadowy shape, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I turned to head back home, my pace quickening as I tried to ignore the sense of panic rising within me. The figure remained where it was, unmoving, and I could feel its presence even as I walked away. When I finally reached our front door, I glanced back one last time, but the figure had vanished. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every rustle of the wind felt menacing. I lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was lurking just outside our door. I kept hearing faint noises that seemed to come from different parts of the house, but when I checked, everything was still. The next day, Tom and I found a small, dark smear on our front door. It looked like the same kind of paint that had been used for the symbols, but it was different, almost as if someone had tried to mimic the mark but failed. I couldn't help but feel that it was a message, a warning of some kind. We reported the new mark to the police, but they found nothing unusual. It was becoming clear that the authorities were running out of leads, and the fear among the residents was growing. People were starting to install security cameras, and some had even gone so far as to move away, unable to handle the anxiety of living under the shadow of the unknown. The feeling of unease was becoming unbearable. I felt as though we were all part of a twisted game, and the rules were being made up as we went along. The presence I had felt on my walk was still haunting me, and the paranoia was creeping into every corner of my life. I tried to stay calm for Tom's sake, but inside, I was a bundle of nerves. Every time I heard a noise or saw a shadow, I couldn't help but wonder if the unseen presence was closing in. The mark on our door, combined with the eerie feeling of being watched, made me fear that we were now a part of something much larger and more terrifying than we could ever understand. The fear had reached its peak. Every day seemed to drag, and every night was filled with endless terror. The town was now a ghost of its former self, with many residents either too scared to leave their homes or having fled in search of safety. Tom and I were holding on by a thread, desperately trying to stay vigilant while grappling with our growing anxiety. One evening, as the sun began to set, we heard a loud knock on our front door. The suddenness of it made us both jump, and we exchanged worried glances. I slowly made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the peephole, I could see nothing but darkness. When I opened the door, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the doorstep. The envelope was plain, with no markings or return address. Trembling, I picked it up and took it inside. Tom and I sat down at the kitchen table and carefully opened it. Inside, there was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in what looked like the same dark paint used for the symbols. The final sign. The message was unsettling, but we couldn't make much sense of it. We decided to show the note to the police, but when we called, they said they had no new updates and were still following leads. Their assurances did little to ease our anxiety. That night, we were both on edge. The house was dark and silent. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant murmur of the remaining few residents who had stayed behind. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the feeling of dread that was slowly suffocating me. Around midnight, a series of loud thumps woke me from my restless sleep. I immediately knew something was wrong. I shook Tom awake, and we both listened intently. The noises seemed to be coming from the attic. Tom grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, and I followed him upstairs, my hands shaking. We slowly made our way to the attic door. The creaking of the old wooden steps seemed to echo through the empty house. Tom turned the knob, and the door swung open with a loud groan. We shined the flashlight around, but the attic was empty. The only thing we found was a large, dusty trunk in the corner. Tom hesitated for a moment before opening the trunk. Inside, we discovered old, faded photographs of families from the town, some of whom were missing. The photos were marked with the same symbol that had appeared on the doors. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the trunk was filled with evidence of the town's dark past. It was then that we heard a sound that made our blood run cold, a soft, eerie whisper coming from behind us. We spun around, but there was no one there. The temperature in the attic seemed to drop suddenly, and a chill ran down my spine. We rushed back downstairs, trying to make sense of what we had found. The photographs and the symbol were unmistakably linked to the disappearances. But what did it all mean? What was the purpose of the symbols and the mysterious trunk? The next day, the police arrived at our house for a routine check-in. We showed them the photographs and the trunk. They seemed as stunned as we were, and for the first time, they admitted that they had no idea what was going on. As the days went by, more and more of the missing families were found, often in similar circumstances, with symbols marked on their homes and personal belongings. The town was finally beginning to piece together the mystery, but the damage had been done. Oakwood would never be the same. Tom and I decided to leave Oakwood behind. The fear, the uncertainty, and the dark past of the town had left an indelible mark on us. We moved to a new place, hoping to escape the shadows of our old life. But even now, years later, the memory of the symbols and the trunk still haunts me. I can't help but wonder if there are more secrets hidden out there, waiting to be uncovered, and if the darkness of Oakwood will ever truly let us go.
The Unknown Passenger.
It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind of night where the streets are empty and the world feels like it's holding its breath. I'd been driving for hours, picking up the usual late-night stragglers, a couple of drunk college kids, an office worker who missed his bus, the usual fare. It was past midnight when I got the ping. The pickup location caught my attention immediately. It was on the outskirts of town, right near the edge of the woods where there were no houses, no stores, nothing. Just a long, empty road that seemed to lead to nowhere. I hesitated for a second, staring at the notification on my phone. These rural fares always paid well, and the app didn't show me the full destination until I accepted. I figured it was probably someone who got stranded out there, maybe a broken-down car. I took a deep breath and accepted the ride. As I drove out of the city, the buildings gave way to open fields and thick patches of trees. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. Streetlights were few and far between, and the only sound in the car was the low hum of my engine. I glanced at the pickup address again, a stretch of road I'd never driven before, with nothing but trees on either side. When I got closer, the GPS instructed me to pull over on the side of the road. There was no one around. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd made a mistake, that no one was here, but then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, just beyond the glow of my headlights. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever it was stood still, too still, like they were watching me, waiting for me to notice them. I strained my eyes, trying to make out their features, but they were dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled low over their face. I unlocked the doors, unsure of what else to do. The figure didn't move right away, and the silence was starting to get to me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they walked slowly toward the car. I could hear their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached, but there was something off about the way they moved, deliberate, like each step was a decision. The passenger didn't say a word as they slid into the back seat. I glanced at the rearview mirror, hoping for some kind of greeting or at least a hint of where they wanted to go, but they just sat there, staring straight ahead. Where are we headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered slightly. No response. Just silence. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Do you have an address?" The passenger shifted slightly, their hood still casting a shadow over their face, and in a voice barely above a whisper, they said, "Just drive." A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't argue. I shifted the car into gear and pulled back onto the road, the unease settling deep in my gut. Something about this felt wrong, but I pushed the thought aside. I'd done countless rides before, and weird passengers were part of the gig. Still, there was something about the stillness in the air, the way the night seemed to stretch out in front of me, that made this ride feel different. As we drove deeper into the dark, empty roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just driving a passenger. I was heading somewhere I shouldn't be. The darkness outside the car was oppressive, almost like it was pressing in from all sides. The road twisted and turned, winding deeper into the countryside, and every so often I'd catch glimpses of the trees on either side of the road through my headlights. Their shadowy forms seemed to loom closer with each mile. The GPS on my phone was flickering, the route recalculating repeatedly, as if it couldn't make up its mind about where we were going. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, trying to get a look at my passenger, but their face remained obscured by the hood. I could feel their eyes on me, though, like a weight on my shoulders. It made me uncomfortable, and I found myself checking the mirrors more often than usual, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that might explain the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The silence was becoming unbearable, so I tried to make conversation. "You're pretty quiet back there. Long night." No response. I cleared my throat and tried again. "So, where are we headed? It looks like we're pretty far out." Still nothing. The passenger just remained motionless, their presence a heavy silence that filled the car. I began to notice how cold the air felt, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the heater I had on. I turned it up, but it didn't seem to help. The road ahead seemed endless, and the GPS screen kept glitching, showing the route looping back on itself in confusing patterns. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but it was hard not to feel a growing sense of dread. The trees felt closer now, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The passengers shifted in their seat, and I caught a glimpse of movement. My heart raced. "Do you, need anything? A drink, maybe?" Finally, the passenger spoke, their voice a low murmur. "You don't need to worry about that." I felt a chill run through me at the words. There was something unnervingly final about the way they said it. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, but the oppressive silence in the car was almost deafening. The occasional beep from the GPS was the only sound breaking through the stillness. As we continued down the dark, winding road, the landmarks around us started to change. Abandoned buildings began to appear, old factories and warehouses that seemed to have been left to rot. The road signs were rusted and barely legible. It was like we were driving through a ghost town, a place that time had forgotten. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease and keep the conversation going. "You sure you don't want to tell me where we're headed? It's getting pretty late." The passenger's reply was cryptic. The destination isn't important. What matters is the journey. That made no sense to me, but I didn't press further. I was too busy trying to keep my focus on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, as I tried to ignore the gnawing sense that we were heading somewhere we shouldn't be. Then, the radio turned on by itself, blasting a wall of static that made me jump. I fumbled with the controls, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't respond. The static filled the car, and for a moment, I could hardly hear anything else. The GPS screen went haywire, displaying a destination that wasn't on the original route. The address was unfamiliar, deep in the woods, miles away from where we were supposed to be. The passenger leaned forward, their voice colder than before. "We're almost there." I tried to slow down, to pull over, but the car wouldn't respond. The brakes felt like they had failed, and the wheels seemed to lock up on me. My heart pounded in my chest as the car continued down the road, deeper into the darkness, with no way to stop. The trees pressed in closer, their shadows merging into one endless, suffocating blackness. In a panic, I glanced back at the passenger, hoping for some explanation or reassurance. But all I saw was that dark, empty hood, and the feeling that whatever was happening, it was far beyond my control. The car hurtled down the dark, deserted road, and I could barely see a thing outside my windows, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. The air in the car was unnaturally cold, making me shiver despite the heater blasting full force. My heart raced as I fought to keep the car on the road, but it felt like the wheel was fighting me back. The passenger remained eerily silent, their presence like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Desperately, I tried to make conversation again, hoping to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. "Is everything okay back there? Do you have any idea where we're going?" The passenger shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought they were going to respond. Then, they leaned forward, their breath cold and strangely metallic against the back of my neck. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but their face was still hidden in shadow. "The journey is what matters," they said softly, almost as if speaking to themselves. "The destination is just a formality." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to make sense of what they meant, but the confusion only added to my growing fear. I forced myself to focus on the road, but the static from the radio was getting louder, and the GPS screen was flickering erratically. "Can you please tell me where we're going?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I don't understand. This doesn't look like any route I've ever seen." The passenger's voice was low, almost soothing, but with an undertone of menace. "There are places beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. This road leads to one of those places." I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling their words left me with, but it clung to me like a cold sweat. The road seemed to twist and turn more sharply, the landmarks outside becoming even stranger. Broken fences, abandoned cars, and old weather-beaten road signs that pointed to nowhere. "Please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "if you know something about where we're going, I need to know. This isn't normal." The passenger remained silent, and I could feel their gaze piercing through me, though I couldn't see their eyes. I looked at the GPS again. It had now displayed an address I'd never seen before, deep in the woods. The more I tried to correct the route, the more the screen seemed to mock me, showing endless loops and wrong turns. The passenger spoke again, their voice barely audible over the static. "You're being led to the place where reality and the unknown meet. It's where many have gone, never to return." The car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the trees, and I felt like we were being watched, followed by something that lurked just beyond the edge of visibility. My attempts to pull over or stop were futile. The car seemed to have its own agenda. Every time I tried to slow down, the engine roared louder, pushing us forward into the darkness. A sudden, violent jolt shook the car, and I glanced back in panic. The passenger had leaned even closer, their voice now a chilling whisper. "We're nearly there. You need to understand, there's no turning back." The fog thickened, rolling in like a living entity, and the road ahead was obscured by a dense, swirling mist. The temperature inside the car dropped even further, and I could see my breath forming a cloud of frost in front of me. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I fought to keep the car under control. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything. Who was this passenger? Why was this happening? And what awaited us at the end of this nightmarish journey? As the car sped through the dark fog, I could only hold on, praying that this ride would end before something truly terrifying happened. The passenger's cryptic words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the horror that awaited. The fog grew thicker, and visibility was almost non-existent. The headlights barely cut through the mist, creating eerie halos of light that danced on the road ahead. Every so often, I would catch glimpses of strange shapes in the darkness, shadows that moved in the periphery of my vision, but when I looked directly, they were gone. I tried to focus on the road, but the fog was so dense that it felt like we were driving through a wall of gray. My breathing grew rapid and shallow, and my heart pounded in my chest. The passenger's silence was unnerving, their presence like a constant, invisible weight pressing down on me. The car seemed to be driving on its own accord, moving faster than I intended. I struggled to keep control. My attempts to steer and brake met with resistance. Every turn felt sharper than the last, and the road seemed to twist in unnatural ways, almost as if it were trying to confound me. "Where are we?" I shouted, my voice almost lost in the roar of the engine and the static from the radio. "Please, tell me what's happening." The passenger finally spoke, their voice as cold and distant as the fog surrounding us. "We're reaching the point where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. There's no turning back now." Panic clawed at my insides. I glanced at the GPS, which had long since given up on providing any coherent direction. The screen was blank now, save for a few flickering lines that did nothing to reassure me. I could feel my grip on the steering wheel slipping as sweat mixed with the cold. Suddenly, the car's headlights revealed a large, dilapidated structure emerging from the fog. It looked like an old factory or warehouse, its walls crumbling and covered in graffiti. The sight sent a jolt of terror through me. This was nowhere near any address I'd ever driven to, and the desolation of the place was beyond anything I had imagined. The car finally came to a stop, though I hadn't consciously braked. The engine sputtered and then died, leaving us in eerie silence. I sat there, frozen, staring at the abandoned building before me. The passenger remained motionless, their presence a dark, oppressive force in the back seat. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I turned to look at the passenger one last time, hoping for some sort of explanation or assurance. Instead, they simply said, "This is where it ends. The journey is complete." With that, they slowly opened the door and stepped out into the fog. I tried to call after them, but my voice came out as a strangled whisper. "Wait, where are you going?" The passenger did not respond. They walked away into the thick mist, their form gradually swallowed up by the shadows. I watched, paralyzed, until they were nothing more than a faint silhouette, then completely gone. I hesitated for a moment before I mustered the courage to get out of the car. The fog was so dense that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the cold was biting. I walked towards the abandoned building, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation. As I approached the building, the eerie silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The door to the building was slightly ajar, creaking softly with every gust of wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight casting weak beams of light on the walls. The interior was as desolate as the outside, dusty, decrepit, and filled with broken machinery and forgotten remnants of a past long gone. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and I felt a sense of dread with every step. The air inside was stale and heavy, adding to the sense of foreboding. I moved deeper into the building, my flashlight flickering intermittently, and my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened to my passenger and what awaited me in this forsaken place. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to whisper secrets of the past, but the truth remained elusive. I felt as though I was walking into a trap, or perhaps into the unknown. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and the sensation that I was not alone in this place made my skin crawl. As I turned a corner, my flashlight illuminated a series of old photographs pinned to the wall. They were faded and yellowed, showing people I didn't recognize. Each photo had been marked with strange symbols and notes scribbled in a language I couldn't decipher. My heart raced as I took in the unsettling scene, realizing that this place held secrets far darker than I had ever imagined. My mind reeled with questions and fears. What had I stumbled into? What had happened to the passenger? And most importantly, would I ever make it out of this nightmarish place? The silence in the abandoned building was almost deafening. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The photographs on the wall had left me shaken, but I forced myself to press on, driven by a desperate need for answers. I turned a corner and entered a large room, its floor littered with debris and broken machinery. The oppressive cold seemed to wrap itself around me, and my breath formed small clouds in the air. I scanned the room, searching for any clue that could explain what had happened. The flashlight beam fell upon an old desk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. Papers were scattered across it, some torn and others faded almost beyond recognition. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest, and began to sift through the papers. Most were mundane, but one document caught my eye. It was a ledger of sorts, with names and dates written in a neat, precise script. A few entries were marked with red ink and had strange symbols drawn next to them. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, trying to decipher their meaning. The names listed were unfamiliar, but as I reached the end of the ledger, I found something that made my blood run cold. The final entry was a date and time that matched the night of my drive, and next to it, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "For the next soul to ride." My stomach churned. It was clear now that this place wasn't just an abandoned factory. It was a site of something much more sinister. I turned away from the desk, feeling a surge of panic. I needed to get out of there, but the building seemed to be shifting around me, the layout changing in a way that made no sense. The fog outside had grown thicker, and as I made my way back toward the entrance, I heard a faint sound coming from deeper within the building. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I navigated through the maze of debris. The thumping grew louder, leading me to a heavy metal door partially hidden behind a stack of crates. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I pried the door open with a groan and stepped into a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was warmer, but it smelled of something metallic and old. In the center of the room stood a large, dusty mirror. Its surface was covered in grime, but it seemed to draw me in. I approached it slowly, my reflection distorted and hazy through the filth. As I wiped away some of the grime, I saw something that made me freeze. In the reflection, I could see the dim outlines of figures standing behind me. They were shadowy and indistinct, but their presence was unmistakable. I spun around, but the room was empty. The figures were gone. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I turned back to the mirror, and the figures were still there, their shapes becoming clearer. They were faces I didn't recognize, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow my every move. It was as though they were trying to communicate something through the glass, but I couldn't make out their expressions. Then, a new figure appeared in the mirror, a familiar face. It was the passenger from the car. Their face was clearer now, and they looked directly at me with an expression of resigned sadness. I could almost hear their voice through the silence. "This is where it ends." I backed away from the mirror, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls seeming to pulse with the rhythm of the heartbeat I had heard earlier. The fog outside had turned into a dense, suffocating mist that pressed against the windows, making it impossible to see outside. I knew I had to leave, but the building had become a labyrinth. Every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the darkness, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My flashlight flickered one last time and then died, plunging me into total darkness. In the pitch black, I stumbled blindly, my panic growing with every step. The thumping sound grew louder, and I could feel the presence of something closing in on me. The fear was overwhelming, and I could barely think straight. Finally, I burst through a door and found myself back outside. The fog was still thick, but I could see the faint outline of the road. I ran towards it, my legs feeling like lead, until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to get inside. As I started the engine, the car roared to life, and I sped away from the building, leaving the nightmare behind. I drove through the fog, my mind racing with the memories of what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, following me from the building. The road stretched out before me, and I drove as fast as I could, desperate to escape the darkness that seemed to cling to me. As I finally reached the safety of the city lights, I couldn't help but look back at the fog, wondering what had truly happened that night. The building, the passenger, the mirror, all of it seemed like a twisted dream, but the fear was real. I never did find out what happened to the passenger or why they had been so cryptic. All I knew was that I had escaped, but the memory of that night would haunt me forever.
The last call.
I still remember the night I first heard Sarah's voice. Her name has haunted me for months now, along with that desperate phone call to 911. At first, it was just another case, another routine investigation in this quiet town where nothing ever happens. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. Sarah was 17, a high school senior. Good grades, part-time job, a normal girl from a normal family. That's what they all said about her. Her parents reported her missing the morning after she didn't come home from work. That's when the nightmare began. I was called in when the police had no leads. They'd found Sarah's phone on the sidewalk just a few blocks from her house. The screen was cracked, and it was covered in dirt, but it still worked. The last thing Sarah did before she vanished was make a call to 911. That call, it's burned into my mind. I've listened to the recording so many times I can recite it by heart, but it never gets any easier to hear. Sarah was terrified. You can hear it in her voice, the way it trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's someone following me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can hear their footsteps. They've been behind me for blocks now. I've walked that route 100 times since. The quiet suburban streets, the dim streetlights, the occasional parked car. It's a neighborhood where you'd never expect anything bad to happen. But that night, something was out there. Something was stalking her." The dispatcher tried to calm her down, asking if she could see who it was. But Sarah didn't respond. She just kept walking, kept talking, the panic rising in her voice. Then there was a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping in the background. Footsteps, matching hers, steady, deliberate. I can still hear them, even now. Every time I close my eyes, those footsteps play on a loop in my mind. "Sarah, are you there?" the dispatcher asked. A moment of silence. Then, her voice again, shaking more than before. "They're getting closer." My heart pounds every time I reach this part of the call. I can feel what she must have felt, the dread, the helplessness of knowing that someone is there, just out of sight, but close enough to catch you. And then, just like that, the call cuts out. No scream, no struggle, just silence. When the police arrived at the scene, there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no clues. Just her phone lying on the ground like she had dropped it mid-step. I thought I had seen it all in my career, but something about this case was different. There was a weight to it, an unease that crept into my bones the moment I started digging into Sarah's life. Everyone had the same story about her. Normal, happy, a good kid. No reason to run away. No enemies. So what happened to her? The official report labeled it a missing person case. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Something important. The more I listened to that call, the more I felt like I was being pulled into it. There was something in the background, beneath the footsteps, beneath her panicked breaths. Something I couldn't quite make out. It was like a whisper, faint but persistent, just out of reach. That's when I knew. This case was far from over. The longer I stayed on the case, the deeper it pulled me in. Sarah's disappearance wasn't like the other missing person cases I'd worked. I could feel it, gnawing at me in ways I couldn't explain. Something was off, more than just the usual panic of not knowing. It was like I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it was right there, staring me in the face. I started by retracing Sarah's steps, again and again. From her job at the diner on 5th Street to her home a few blocks away, it was a route I knew too well by now. I'd walk it late at night, the same time she did, hoping to feel whatever she felt, hoping to see what she saw. But there was nothing. No cars, no people, just the empty, quiet streets of this small, suffocating town. The kind of place where bad things aren't supposed to happen, but they do. You can feel it in the air, that something dark is lurking just beneath the surface. I visited her parents next, hoping to learn something the police missed. They were kind, heartbroken people. Her mom hadn't touched Sarah's room since the day she disappeared. I could feel the weight of her grief the moment I stepped inside. Her bed was still unmade, a half-empty glass of water sat on the nightstand, and the air was heavy with the smell of old perfume. I spent hours in that room, looking for anything, anything, that might explain what happened to her. But all I found were the remnants of a normal teenage life. Textbooks, photos with friends, old concert tickets. It felt wrong, like I was intruding on someone's memories. But there was something else too, something I couldn't shake, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone in that room. I had this strange sensation, like someone was watching me. Every time I turned around, it was as if something shifted just out of sight. But when I looked, the room was still. Empty. The rational part of me knew it was just my nerves playing tricks. But there was another part of me, a quieter, more primal part, that wasn't so sure. Later that night, I went back to my office and played Sarah's 911 call again. I'd already listened to it dozens of times, but this time I focused on the background noise. It's subtle, so subtle I almost missed it, but beneath the sound of her footsteps, there's something else. It's hard to describe. A low hum, maybe, or a whisper. It's faint, like it's trying to stay hidden, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. I sent the audio to a tech I know, someone who specializes in cleaning up audio files. Maybe he'd find something I couldn't. In the meantime, I kept digging. I interviewed some of Sarah's friends, hoping they might have noticed something strange before she disappeared. That's when I met Claire, her best friend. Claire was different from the others. Nervous, like she was afraid to say too much. She admitted that Sarah had confided in her a few days before she went missing. She said she felt like someone was watching her, Claire told me, her voice barely above a whisper, like saying it too loud might summon something. She thought it was just her imagination at first, but she was really freaked out. Did she say anything else? I pressed. Claire hesitated, glancing around as if someone might be listening. She told me she heard things at night when she was alone. I didn't need to ask what kind of things. I knew. I'd heard them too, in the recording. Did she ever see anyone? I asked. Claire shook her head. No, but she swore someone was following her. She could feel it. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just some random disappearance. Sarah had known something was coming for her. She felt it. And now, so did I. That night, as I sat in my car, parked near the spot where her phone had been found, I tried to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. All I knew was that I was getting closer to something I didn't fully understand, but that terrified me nonetheless. I sat there, staring at the dark, empty street, listening. The night was still, unnervingly quiet. But then, just as I was about to start the car and leave, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness just behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The street was empty. I was alone. But I knew what I'd heard. Those footsteps, the same ones Sarah had heard. They were following me now. After that night, things changed. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched, it all followed me home. I thought I could separate myself from the case, but I couldn't shake the creeping sensation that something was now attached to me, lurking just out of sight. It was like a shadow I couldn't escape, a presence lingering in every corner of my life. The following morning, I got a call from the audio tech. He sounded rattled, which was unusual for him. "You need to hear this," he said. "There's something in that recording, something you wouldn't notice unless you enhanced the background." I didn't ask any more questions. I drove straight to his office, my stomach in knots the whole way. I had no idea what I was about to hear, but deep down, I already knew it was going to be bad. When I got there, He played the cleaned-up version of Sarah's 911 call. Her voice was still the same, frantic, scared. The footsteps were still there too, steady and deliberate. But now, underneath it all, something else emerged. Something far more sinister. At first, it was just a faint, distorted sound, like static or a low hum. But as the audio tech filtered out more of the noise, the sound became clearer. It wasn't static. It was a voice. A whispering voice, almost drowned out by the background noise, but unmistakable. The words were barely audible, but I could make them out. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk. I froze. My skin went cold. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was something else, something that had been there with her in those final moments. The tech looked at me, his face pale. I don't know what the hell that is, but it's not normal. I left his office with the audio file, the words looping over and over in my head. I see you. It felt like the whisper wasn't just directed at Sarah. It was directed at anyone who listened. Anyone who got too close. Back at my apartment, I tried to calm myself down. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop, the file still open on my screen. But I couldn't bring myself to listen to it again. Every time I thought about pressing play, the whisper echoed in my mind, sending chills down my spine. I started to question everything. What if Sarah had heard it too? What if she wasn't just being followed by a person, but by something else? Something not human. It was late by the time I finally managed to get some sleep, but even then, I couldn't escape it. I dreamt of Sarah. In my dream, she was running down that same street, the street I'd walked so many times. The footsteps behind her were louder now, faster, closing in. But when she turned to look, there was no one there. Just shadows. Dark, shifting shadows that seemed to move with her, reaching out. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my body paralyzed by fear. And then I heard it, outside my bedroom door. Footsteps. I shot up in bed, listening. My apartment was dark, silent except for the faint creaking of the floorboards just outside my room. I told myself it was just the building settling, that I was imagining things. But deep down I knew. The footsteps were real. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed 911. As the phone rang, I felt ridiculous. I was a seasoned investigator, and here I was, calling for help because of a few creaks in the night. But the fear was real. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I could explain. The dispatcher answered, her voice calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could get the words out, the line went dead. No static, no beep, just silence. I looked at my phone, confused, and tried to call again. But the screen froze. The phone wouldn't respond. That's when I felt it, a cold draft, like someone had opened a window, though I knew all my windows were locked. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the door. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door handle, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, as I reached for the handle, there it was again. A whisper. Faint, just like on the recording. Asterisk, I see you. Asterisk. I yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. But the air was cold, and I could feel it, that same presence I'd felt in Sarah's room. It was here, with me now, watching. Waiting. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't go back to my apartment for a while after that night. I told myself I needed space, but the truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of returning. Something was waiting for me there, something I didn't know how to face. Instead, I holed up in my office, surrounded by the chaos of the case, hoping that the constant noise of papers and files would drown out the whispers that had begun to haunt my every waking thought. The recording was all I could think about. The voice, the footsteps, and the way the temperature dropped the moment I heard it outside my own door. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a coincidence. Sarah had felt it, Claire had sensed it, and now it was following me, too. I kept listening to the recording over and over, searching for any detail I might have missed. The whisper, "I see you," echoed louder each time. It became clearer, more distinct, almost like it was trying to communicate something, trying to warn me. My phone buzzed suddenly, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Claire. She sounded panicked, her voice trembling as she spoke. "You need to come over," she said. "Now." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and rushed out, my heart racing the whole drive over. Whatever Claire had to tell me, I knew it wasn't going to be good. When I arrived at her house, she opened the door quickly, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything at first, just motioned for me to follow her inside. Her usually neat living room was a mess, furniture pushed around, curtains half torn down, as if someone had been searching for something in a panic. "What happened?" I asked, my voice low. Claire's hands shook as she handed me her phone. "It's Sarah," she whispered. "She sent me something." I stared at the phone screen, confused. "Sarah? But that's—" "I know," Claire interrupted, her voice trembling. "But look." She pulled up her messages. There, at the top of the screen, was a text from Sarah's old number. My stomach twisted as I read it. "I see you." My mind raced. It had to be a sick joke, someone using her number to torment Claire. But how? And why? Before I could ask any more questions, Claire scrolled down to an attachment, an audio file. She pressed play. The same whisper echoed from her phone. "I see you." And then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just like in Sarah's 911 call. But there was something new, something I hadn't heard before. After the footsteps, the sound of breathing, labored, shallow, like someone was struggling to catch their breath. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It came last night," Claire said, "at 3:15 in the morning, the exact time Sarah disappeared." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this, it wasn't playing by normal rules. This wasn't just some prank. It was real, and it was getting closer. "Has anything else happened?" I asked, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. Claire nodded, her face pale. "Last night, I heard someone outside. Footsteps, just like Sarah described. I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw someone. My breath caught in my throat." "Who?" She hesitated, her voice barely audible. "It looked like Sarah." That single sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. Sarah was gone, missing for weeks, presumed dead, and yet Claire was telling me she'd seen her, walking outside her window in the dead of night. My rational mind fought against the idea, but deep down, I believed her. We were no longer dealing with just a disappearance. Something darker had taken hold of this case, something beyond my comprehension. That night, I stayed at Claire's house. I couldn't let her be alone, not after what she'd experienced. As the hours passed, the weight of the unknown pressed down on us both, neither of us daring to speak about the terror that lingered just beyond the walls. Around 3 a.m., I sat in the dark living room, my eyes heavy from lack of sleep, when I heard it again. The same sound that had haunted me for days. Footsteps. But this time, they were right outside the window. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as I moved toward the window. Claire was asleep upstairs, but I knew if she heard this, she'd be thrown into another panic. The footsteps stopped just beneath the window. I could feel whoever, or whatever, it was, standing just outside. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain, pulling it aside in one swift motion. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure, standing at the edge of the street, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, unnaturally still, its face obscured by the darkness. I wanted to move, to shout, but my body froze. It just stood there, watching me. And then, I heard it, right behind me this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. "I see you." I spun around, but the room was empty. Yet I could feel it. Something was there, watching, waiting. The air was heavy with its presence. That was when I knew it was coming for us next. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind outside felt like it carried a threat. I stayed awake, watching, waiting. The figure I had seen outside, the voice that whispered, "I see you, haunted my every thought. Whatever it was closing in, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The morning light brought no comfort. The atmosphere in Claire's house was thick with dread, an invisible weight pressing down on us both. We didn't talk about the night before, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. It wasn't over. Not even close. I decided it was time to confront it. We couldn't keep running, hiding in the shadows of our own fear. There had to be a way to break whatever hold this thing had on us. And I had a feeling the answer was somewhere in Sarah's 911 call. I listened to the recording again, but this time I was focused. I replayed the exact moment when the whisper, "I see you, echoed in the background. Then I slowed it down, adjusting the speed, amplifying every tiny detail that I might have missed before. And there it was. A sound I hadn't noticed earlier, buried beneath the whisper and the footsteps. It was faint, but unmistakable, the faint whir of a siren. Not loud enough to be nearby, but close enough to suggest that someone else might have been there. I froze as the realization hit me. Whoever, or whatever, had been stalking Sarah that night wasn't alone. And now, it wasn't alone in coming after us. I grabbed my coat and keys. "We're going to the station," I said to Claire. "We need to listen to the original tape." She didn't argue. She just nodded, the color drained from her face. We both knew this was our last chance to find answers. At the police station, we were met with skepticism. Officers were used to dealing with missing persons cases, but they weren't ready for the kind of terror that had invaded our lives. Eventually, though, we were led into the evidence room, where the original 911 call was stored. They played the tape, and I listened carefully again. The same familiar sounds, the footsteps, the whisper, but this time the whirring sound was clearer. My heart raced. It wasn't just a siren. It was something else, something mechanical. Suddenly, Claire gasped. "Look at the timestamp," she whispered, pointing to the screen where the call log was displayed. The call from Sarah had been logged at 3:15 a.m., the exact time Claire had received that eerie text message. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't a coincidence. The timeline was no accident. Sarah's last call had been a warning, and we had ignored it for too long. Just as I was about to ask to replay the tape again, the lights in the room flickered. My skin prickled as the temperature dropped, just like it had in my apartment that night. "Do you feel that?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper, like something was seeping through the walls. And then we heard it. Footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, growing louder, closer. The officers looked at each other, confused, but Claire and I knew. It was the same sound we had heard on the recording, the same sound that had haunted us both for days. It was here. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped just outside the room, and the lights flickered again. I could feel it, whatever it was, standing just beyond the door, waiting. One of the officers moved to open it. "Wait!" I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He swung the door open, and the hallway was empty. But I knew better. It was here, hiding in the shadows, watching us. Claire grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't argue. We ran, bolting down the hall and out of the station, my pulse pounding in my ears. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cold morning air. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. 4 days after, I tried to move on. I tried to convince myself that we had escaped, that whatever dark force had taken Sarah had finally left us alone. But deep down, I knew the truth. I could still feel it, hovering just out of sight, lurking in the corners of my mind. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I hadn't heard since that night at Claire's house. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from just outside my apartment door. My body froze in place, the terror paralyzing me. The air grew cold, and I could hear the faintest whisper through the walls. "I see you." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My mind raced as I realized the truth. I was next. Just like Sarah, just like Claire, it was coming for me. And then my phone buzzed. I forced myself to look at the screen, my hands trembling. It was a text. 3:15 a.m. I stared at the clock in the corner of my phone. It was 3:15. And then another message appeared. "I see you." The footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. There was no escape. It had always been watching, waiting for the right moment. I was trapped, just like Sarah had been. And now, it was my turn to disappear into the dark.